Have you ever thought about why God oftentimes chooses weakness and suffering to display His glory? That's a big question, isn't it? Stick with us this week on Radiant Pulse, and we'll talk about that. Well, good afternoon, Radiant, or good morning, depending on when you're watching this. And I appreciate you spending a few minutes with me this morning talking about God's grace and His love, and why oftentimes He chooses to display His strength and power in our weakness and oftentimes our suffering. Because we all know that we both suffer going through the valleys. We feel the turmoil of the world around us. We feel weak and powerless to do anything about it. And yet, in those moments, that's when we sense and see the amazing power of God. So, think about this for a minute. Think about the Apostle Paul. And we know this story. We talk about it all the time. And in 2 Corinthians, where Paul is talking about the fact that he has so much that he could boast about. I mean, think about it. Here is a man who has transformed this movement, this following of Jesus, of the Messiah, and proclaimed Him all over the Middle East, walking in the places of power and authority in Rome, in Greece, in present-day Turkey, in Israel, all over. He's proclaiming the glory of the gospel and changing lives and establishing all of the churches. And he has written so much about this. He has a lot that he could boast about. And yet he says that experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Because he was given this thorn, this struggle, this weakness in his body or in his spirit or in his mind. Something was put there or allowed to be there by God in order for God to show His power through Paul. And he says in 2 Corinthians 12:8, he says 3 times, this is Paul talking, he says 3 times I begged the Lord to take it away. And each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So Paul unsuccessfully begs the Lord to remove this thorn in the flesh. He begs Him 3 times, and instead of removing that thorn, removing that weakness, removing that struggle, God explains that the lesson that the thorn was meant to teach, the lesson that the thorn was in place to teach Paul. And he says in 12:8, my grace is sufficient for you. For power is perfected, made whole, completed in weakness. So what sort of power best demonstrated or perfected through weakness? What sort of power is that? Paul went on to identify this as the power of Christ, a power that was not demonstrated in pride, it's not demonstrated in boasting, it's not demonstrated in accomplishments, it's not demonstrated in how much you know, your degrees, the money you have. None of that demonstrates the power of God. Paul identifies this power as the power of Christ, a power not demonstrated in those things, in boasting and in pride, but in humble, self-giving service to others, leading ultimately to death on a cross. Now, what do you mean? What's going on? What do we mean that power is only displayed in the weakness of the cross? Listen to me. It's only in this moment of terrible weakness that Jesus takes on that weakness, that suffering, that death on the cross. It's only then that the power of the resurrection is released into the world. Paul's affliction, his suffering, his thorn is training him to choose humble, self-giving weakness, the weakness of Christ, over the temptation to pride and boasting and power. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, he says that. He says, So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure. Paul saying, I take pleasure in this weakness. I take pleasure in this suffering. Why is that? And in the insults, the hardships and the persecutions, the troubles, and all the things that I'm going through, all of those things that I suffer for Christ. Because when I am weak, then I am strong. So as a result of this, as a result of his attitude, his change in his perspective, Paul is changing his perspective about the thorn, about the weakness, about the suffering that he's dealing with, the hardships in his life. He's changing his perspective on that, and that afflicted life becomes a vehicle to exalt God rather than himself. So let me remind you of this story in the Old Testament that's kind of parallel to this with Jacob. Do you remember the story? Jacob takes his wives, 2 wives, and his children, 11 children, if you can imagine, and he's going away with them. And he gets to this place and he meets this man and he begins to wrestle with him. And this old story is in Genesis, and he says in Genesis chapter 32, beginning in verse 22, he says, during the night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the river with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all his possessions. And this left Jacob alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled him until dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. And the man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? The man asked. He replied, Jacob. Verse 26, your name will no longer be Jacob. The man told him, from now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. So think about this. Jacob is wrestling with God and not letting him go. And the only way that God wins with Jacob wrestling him is to touch his hip and wrench it out of its socket. And so Jacob spends the rest of his years afflicted by this limp, this thorn, literally in his side that he received at the hand of God. Jacob, I think, viewed this as let's call it a grace limp. He viewed this as a grace limp because the dislocation of his hip, that pain, that thorn, that suffering in his hip constantly reminded him that he had met God and for once had refused to let God go. He refused to let God go. And he receives a blessing for himself and his descendants. Let me ask you this. Are you willing to face God and learn the lessons that he has for you in the midst of your affliction? Have your places of affliction, your seasons of weakness, have they become reminders of God's grace and strength? Or are they reminders of how bad things are, how things could be so much better, how you don't deserve this? Or have you learned, like Paul and like Jacob, to be content with weakness, with insults, with distresses, with persecution, with afflictions, with difficulties for Christ's sake? For when we are weak, then we are made truly strong. Are you allowing your life to be a vehicle that exalts God rather than yourself, like Paul? Listen, it can be really hard to find peace when we're going through seasons of difficulty. But when we change our perspective and when we see in our weakness that God is exalted, when we don't let go of him, when we continue to wrestle with him, when we come face to face with God and we don't run. We run towards him. We hold him tight and we don't let him go. And we wrestle with God. Even through our affliction, through our suffering, we wrestle with him. And we receive his blessing because of that. It can be difficult to find peace in those seasons. But let me tell you, God is present. And in your weakness, and in your suffering, and in the thorn in your side, in your flesh, in your hip, God is making himself known to you and to those around you and to the rest of the world. Well, thanks for spending a few minutes with me today. I know that's a tough subject to talk about, thorns in the flesh and weakness and affliction, but it's a great lesson for us to learn about the power of God and his grace and his love, because his grace is sufficient. It's enough for us. I appreciate you spending that time with me today and thinking about this. I pray for you daily, guys, and I love you so much. Ricky and Taylor, we all talk about how much we love what we do, the calling that God has on our lives, the excitement of what's happening at Radiant, and the things that we're building there for God and watching God build through us. So if you don't have a church home, we encourage you to come, 15 Crane Avenue in Greenville. We worship on Sundays at 10 o'clock. We have fellowship at 9:30. Lots of activities going on all the time during the week and on the weekends. And we just encourage you to get plugged in, to come and worship with us. I promise you, it is an amazing experience to come and worship and learn about God at Radiant Church. Well, guys, have a great week. We love you, and we'll see you soon.